Hi, welcome. This is a short video just to show how we can consume a Chatter profile photo. I'm going to be going through using Informatica Cloud Real-Time to do this. We'll be using a service connector, which is basically the way that we can consume any REST or SOAP-based API. So just looking at the documentation, I'm logged in here over here to our instance of Salesforce, and I've basically updated the profile photo here with an old dusty photo. And if I was to log into Workbench, just to show you the way that this works, is that on the user object, there's actually if we go and check user, there's actually two fields of interest. So even if you were going to just query this any other way, for every user, you basically have a full photo and a small photo URL. So if I just go to my user detail here and copy my user ID, and then I just put that in the filter here, then I can see those values. Now, if you're going to get this from the Salesforce API, the slight restriction here is that you'll need an active session in order to do that. So in order to do it from an external application, the most straightforward way to do this is actually via the Chatter API. And that has a built-in mechanism for using OAuth, which we can actually use fairly easily here in Cloud Real-Time, Informatica Cloud Real-Time. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, if I just go back to the documentation for a sec, the way that we identify and find these user profiles, according to the documentation, is from version 35 onwards, we have the ability to make a call directly to this user profiles resource, and if we pass the user ID in there, we can retrieve the photo. It supports a get, delete, or a post. And you can do things like even send cropping attributes to it to get it to crop that on the server side. In this case, what we're going to do is we're literally just going to do a get against that so that we can retrieve the basic the URL that I've just shown you in that previous query, SOQL query that we ran. But then we need another call after that to actually get the binary data, because we want to get that as an attachment, so we can actually then either store that on a file system, or potentially use Informatica Cloud Real-Time to send that to any other application. Which is again, one of the reasons why this isn't just a straight batch use case. We actually, if we wanted to send that off to another application, then we've got to do the authentication via OAuth, the authorization, and then we actually have to retrieve the value, and then we decide what to do with that. Get it as a binary attachment, for example. So let's have a look at how this is implemented. If we go into the service connector, I actually had a service connector that already implemented some of the basics of Chatter. So we've got in here in the Actions tab here, we have an action named Chatter Authentication. And basically what this does is, if we go to the binding section, it's going to call to get a token. And there's a few parameters that we need to pass through, which are actually stored in the definition section as connection properties. The reason for that is, once you define a service connector and you want that to be consumed by lots of different guides or processes, then the user credentials actually might change as you go through this. So you want to make sure that you're able to pass those in as parameters. So I'm going to show you how to do this in a second, but basically we have the URL, the client ID, the client secret, the Salesforce username, and the Salesforce password all passed through here. And when we go to the Actions tab, you can see that we've just used, you can go into the formula builder here and then just select the connection properties to pass those in as variables. It's pretty straightforward, but we're going to pass those through, and what happens is when we go and do a test, if I was to run a test here, it's actually going to call off to the URL that we've defined. It's going to pass all of the parameters that we've mentioned in the binding here in these other parameters section. It's going to pass those through as post parameters, and then it's going to retrieve, look at the response, and then we can easily pass the values that come back from the response. In this case, all we have is two properties that come back, token type and an access token, and then we're going to use those in subsequent calls. So just if you're setting this up from scratch, you may be wondering where we got the client ID, the client secret from. Well, in order to do that, you need to set up what's called a connected app in Salesforce. So if you go into connected apps, and then you scroll to, hold on, actually it's not in that one, it's in app. So in apps, create apps, and then you'll notice here I created an app called Informatica Cloud Real-Time. And if you go into that, and you can create this from scratch, and basically you give it a name, and within that, if I just go into edit, it might make more sense. So this is the screen that you'll see when you're creating. For the callback URL, I just used the suggested default, which is the login.salesforce.com with the callback ending to that, which is actually listed in this hover over example, this tip here. I put some OAuth scopes in here, but I didn't actually need these because we make the call to get the token using a grant type of password, which is listed in the API documentation. But so you could actually, I think you could leave that blank, but I've just put in a few of the defaults that I need in there. And then here, all I did was then just save this, and it appears in the connected apps section. So once I've got it in the once I've saved that, it does take about 5 to 10 minutes. There'll be a warning coming up that says that you can't use it within the first sort of 2 to 10 minutes. Generally, I've found in practice it takes about a maximum 10 minutes before it will actually acknowledge this consumer key if you're making any calls to it. But this is really the important thing here. We've got the consumer key, which I can take, and the consumer secret. You just click to reveal and you can copy that. And those are the values that should go in here, this client ID and client secret. And that's what you're going to actually post during the authorization call. So I do apologize, we're mixing and matching authentication and authorization here. That should actually say chatter authorization. And so basically, once you've done that and you get these results back, you get these two values, token type and access token, and then I can go to my subsequent call, which is this chatter get photo. Now, one of the great things in Cloud Real-Time is we have the ability to actually inherit, so that we don't have to repeat ourselves in every call. So I just created this action of chatter base here. And that is an action type of abstract, and that allows me to define input parameters that we're going to use in every call, and it just means that I can inherit from that in other calls, and I don't have to keep repeating, setting that up in the input tab every time. So I set the OAuth token, and I've pasted in the results of that first call, that token that we get, so that I can then reuse that in any subsequent calls. So with this being an abstract action, that's really all I need to define. And if I go into chatter get photo on the action tab, I inherit from chatter base. And if I go to the input tab, you'll see that it's automatically included this auth token automatically. So the additional attribute I put in here was a user ID. because when we're calling off to the Chatter API to get the profile, we need to know which user ID we're actually getting the profile photo for. In the binding section, I have basically got the inherited binding from Chatterbase, which is the standard, the URL that's defined in the connection properties, and then the standard Chatter URL, which is services data, and then the version that we're calling. And then I've switched it to extend, and extend means that I can, literally add a piece of information to the inherited base URL here. And basically it says connect user profiles, which I got from the documentation. I've put in here the parameter from the input tab of user ID and then the ending of photo. So that's just in line with this documentation here that we've seen, where I've passed in a dynamic user ID, and the rest is just to pull the photo information. So that's all I need. In the HTTP headers, we've already inherited everything that we had from Chatterbase, which is that as part of the header for every call, we want to send the bearer. That's defined again. I got that from the Chatter documentation, the API documentation, and the content type as well. So if I've gone, I went through and I already did my authentication. I'll do it again just so you can see. So if I do a test here and I get back this access token, I copy that, I go into Chatterbase, and in the input tab I'm going to paste that in as my token that I'm going to use for all the calls. Click save, and then I go to get photo, and in here you can see it's inherited already. I've got my user ID, which is all well and good, and from here all I need to do is actually click test on Chatter get photo, and it's pulled back this entire list, which is all just I've just defined these as properties in my output tab: full email, photo URL, large photo. There's a whole series of them that come back. The guidance in the documentation is that you should actually, if you're pulling this into a mobile application or something like that, you should really cache the photo, and you should only change, refresh that cache when you find that the photo version ID is actually changed. In this case, we're just going to be taking the results of this and not going through the caching. We're just going to show how we get that as an attachment. So here's my full photo URL. So what I'm going to do is copy that. And again, I'm doing this to show you how the service connector works. In actual fact, when you use the service connector you'd be using it in a process, and the process is what would handle, making the call to the same service connector to do the authorization, then to do the get photo, and then finally to pass the results, this URL here, we'd pass that as a parameter into the get photo binary, which would allow us to get the binary data for the attachment. So I'm just showing you how to test it in the service connector as opposed to string it all together in a process. So from here we've got the value back from that get photo. So the next step is to go into get photo binary into the input, and in the get URL I'm going to paste the URL of the image that I want to retrieve. And this would work for any type of image or binary file that you want to retrieve. It's a very simple action where all you've got is the URL that you're going to use as a get, and we paste that into the URL parameter here, which I just overwrote because I'm inheriting from Chatterbase. We need the OAuth token, yes, and we're going to leave the content type out, so I've set that to exclude because here we're not going to be inheriting the standard content type. And then in the output tab, it doesn't really matter what you call this this name here. It doesn't have to align to anything because we're going to be setting the type to attachment, and get from instead of trying to get a property in XML or anything like that, we're going to switch it to attachment, and that's going to know to automatically look for binary data. So now all I need to do now is hit test, and we can see that yes, it has actually found the file data. And if you were to look in the response, you can see that we've got some metadata about this, about the length, the date, and so on, and the status code. You can obviously choose to return those as additional outputs, but the one I'm interested in really is the file attachment data, and Cloud Realtime puts in this additional link here that then allows me to test that I've actually got the correct file here. So what I can do here is if I just save that as, let's say I'll save it as a JPEG and give it a name here, save it, use JPEG, yep, and open this up, and there's the binary data that we've got directly from Chatter. So obviously, going through this, now that I've saved that, if I'd save that and publish, I could fairly easily create a process that would then consume this service connector. And as I said before, you basically pass these details in to do the authorization, get the token back, and then you'd make the get profile photo call, and then you'd retrieve the response from that and make the get profile photo binary call to get the binary data. So I hope you find that useful, and please take a look on our website for more details. Thanks very much.